The briefing room aboard the Union warship Ardent Horizon was filled with tension so thick you could slice it with a plasma blade. Officers from various alien species huddled around a holographic map of the latest Drath-controlled territories, their faces grim and tired. Strategies had been discussed, battle plans debated, but hope, that was a resource in dangerously short supply. Commander Drovax, a hulking reptilian with scales the color of tarnished copper, crossed his arms and let out a low growl. We've tried overwhelming force. We've tried precision strikes. Nothing changes. The Drath grind us down, battle by battle. Captain Varlix, an insectoid Traynax with multifaceted eyes, clicked his mandibles irritably. Morale across the Union is disintegrating. Troops are deserting. We cannot keep this up, as if summoned by fate, or perhaps something far stranger. The doors to the room slid open with a cheerful whoosh. In strolled Captain Riley, Smirk Callahan, leader of the newly arrived human contingent. His casual demeanor was a stark contrast to the grim atmosphere. Dressed in combat fatigues, a battered leather jacket slung over his shoulder, and a mischievous grin plastered across his face. He looked like a man who had just walked into a bar, not a war council. "Good news, folks," he announced, clapping his hands. "The cavalry's here, and we brought jokes." Drovax's eyes narrowed dangerously. "This is not a time for humor, human." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, my scaly friend," Callahan said, his grin unfaltering. "This is exactly the time for humor." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Varlix rubbed his antennae in exasperation, trying to decipher if this human was deliberately obtuse or just naturally reckless. "You do understand the gravity of our situation, yes? Our forces are stretched thin. Planets are falling. Laughter won't win this war." Callahan leaned casually against the table, tapping one of the holographic projections like it was a toy. "Laughter won't win the war, but it might just get us through it." Before Drovax could retort, the hologram flickered, showing the latest combat reports. Another planet had been lost, another battalion routed. The exhaustion on everyone's faces deepened. Yet Callahan's grin remained as steady as a lighthouse beacon in a storm. "Look," Callahan said, his tone softening slightly. "I get it. You've been at this a long time. Too long. And now it's like you're fighting with both fists tied behind your backs, weighed down by all that fear and frustration. What you need isn't just strategy. What you need is to remember why you're still in this fight. And if there's one thing humans are good at, it's finding reasons to laugh, even when things look bleak." Drovax huffed a low, skeptical rumble. "This is war, human. It is no place for frivolity." "Tell that to us," Callahan said, his grin widening. "We've been cracking jokes since the first rock hit us on Earth. Hell, we turned plagues into punchlines and made memes about taxes. Trust me, if there's one thing that unites people, it's the ability to laugh in the face of doom." Before anyone could respond, the klaxons blared through the ship, signaling an incoming attack. A swarm of Drath fighters had been detected on the outer perimeter, and ground forces were preparing for battle. "Well," Callahan said, straightening his jacket, "no time like the present." The battlefield on Exor Fief was a mess of jagged rock formations, trenches, and hastily erected fortifications. Union troops, members of various alien species, crouched behind cover, grim and silent, as they awaited the Drath assault. The enemy was relentless, known for their brutal efficiency and unwavering focus. Callahan and his human squad took up positions alongside the Traynax soldiers, who were stiff and formal, as though allergic to any form of levity. One of the Traynax soldiers gave Callahan a wary glance. "Are you humans always like this?" the alien asked hesitantly. "So casual?" Callahan grinned. "Only when we're breathing." Before the Traynax could respond, the first wave of Drath soldiers came into view. Black-armored behemoths, their weapons glowing with ominous energy. The ground trembled beneath their march, and fear rippled through the Union ranks. "Right," Callahan said, cracking his knuckles. "Let's lighten the mood a bit." Without warning, he stood up, holding a bright orange object above his head. "Hey, Drath, what's the difference between your mom and a starship?" The Drath soldiers paused, clearly puzzled. "She's bigger," Callahan shouted, hurling the orange object, an ancient, earth-made rubber chicken, directly at them. The rubber chicken sailed through the air in slow motion, bouncing harmlessly off the nearest Drath soldier's helmet with a pitiful squeak. For a heartbeat, The battlefield was dead silent. Then, inexplicably, one of the Drath soldiers let out a short, snorting laugh. Another followed. Soon, their chuckles turned into belly laughs, echoing across the battlefield. The Traynax soldiers stared, dumbfounded. "They're laughing?" Callahan grinned. "Told ya, humor wins wars." Seizing the moment of confusion, the Union forces launched a surprise counterattack, overwhelming the Drath troops before they could regroup. When the dust settled, Captain Varlix approached Callahan, his mandibles twitching in disbelief. "I do not understand. How did you know that would work?" Callahan shrugged. "Didn't. But when all else fails, you throw a rubber chicken. That's just science." Back at the camp that night, the mood was lighter than it had been in weeks. Soldiers, alien and human alike, sat around makeshift campfires, trading jokes and sharing stories. Laughter filled the air, an unfamiliar but welcome sound in a war that had known only silence and fear. Commander Drovax, still skeptical but curious, joined Callahan at one of the fires. "So," the reptilian commander rumbled, "this is your grand strategy? Jokes and rubber chickens?" Callahan smirked, toasting a marshmallow over the fire. "Hey, it's working so far." Drovax huffed. "I admit, it is strange, but effective." Callahan leaned back, gazing at the stars overhead. "Laughter isn't just about jokes, Commander. It's about hope. It's about reminding people that no matter how bad things get, there's always something worth smiling about." For a moment, Drovax considered the human's words. Then, with a gruff nod, he reached for a nearby ration tin. "Tell me, human, do you know any jokes about Kalrathi?" Callahan's grin widened. "Oh, buddy, you have no idea." The fire crackled, and laughter spread through the camp like wildfire, carrying with it the first glimmers of hope the Union forces had seen in far too long. But even as the night wore on and the jokes continued, a lingering question remained in Callahan's mind. How long could they keep laughing? And what would happen when the real darkness arrived? The answer, he knew, would come soon enough. As the camp quieted for the night, Callahan leaned closer to Drovax, whispering conspiratorially, "You ever wonder what happens when a Kalrathi walks into a bar?" By the next morning, the story of the rubber chicken incident had spread through the Union ranks like wildfire. Soldiers from every species recounted the bizarre moment when an Earth artifact, of all things, had turned the tide of a battle. For the first time in months, the Union camps buzzed with something they thought they'd forgotten: genuine laughter. At one of the forward operating bases, Captain Callahan lounged on a crate, tossing a ball back and forth with one of his squad mates. Nearby, a group of insectoid Traynax soldiers watched with curiosity, their mandibles twitching in puzzlement. It was as though they were observing an alien species themselves, a group of soldiers relaxed and playful in the midst of a brutal, ongoing war. "They're confused," Callahan said quietly to his second-in-command, Lieutenant Hannah Webb, who sat beside him, polishing a combat knife. Webb chuckled. "They don't know what to make of us, and honestly, I don't blame them." Just then, Captain Varlix approached, his multifaceted eyes glinting with irritation. "Human," he began, his tone as sharp as his insectoid limbs. "Your antics in the field yesterday, they were effective, but chaotic. War is not a circus." Callahan grinned. "Tell that to the Drath soldiers. They seem to love it." Varlix clicked his mandibles in frustration. "You won one battle with your methods, but humor cannot replace tactics. Morale boosts are fleeting. You won't win a war this way." Callahan's grin didn't falter. "Care to bet on that?" The Traynax captain tilted his head, his antennae flicking in agitation. "Bet? That's right." Callahan leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Next engagement, we won't fire a single shot. I'll use humor to disarm the Drath. If I win, you stop grumbling about our methods." Varlix narrowed his eyes, clearly weighing the odds. "And if you fail, then we'll do it your way," Callahan replied. "But only after you laugh. Just once." Varlix's antennae twitched in what could almost be called disbelief. "You're on." 2 hours later, Callahan and his squad gathered in the briefing room to prepare for their next mission. Their objective, an outpost deep within Drath territory, heavily fortified and vital to enemy supply lines. It was a daunting task, one that any sane strategist would approach with stealth or overwhelming force. But Callahan's plan was anything but sane. "All right, folks," he began, pacing in front of a holographic map. "We're not just going to infiltrate this base. We're going to confuse the hell out of it." Lieutenant Webb arched an eyebrow. "Care to elaborate, Captain?" Callahan smirked. "We're going to hijack their communication systems and flood their channels with Earth's finest content. Memes, pranks, maybe a little stand-up comedy. The goal isn't just to distract them, it's to break their focus entirely. If they're too busy laughing or scratching their heads, they won't be able to fight." The room fell silent for a moment as the squad processed the sheer absurdity of the plan. Then, one by one, the soldiers grinned. They were in. When they arrived at the Drath outpost under cover of night, Callahan's team slipped through the perimeter undetected. Using portable hacking tools, they tapped into the enemy's communication network, piggybacking off internal comms. Then the real fun began. "Broadcasting now," Webb whispered, fingers flying over her datapad. Within seconds, the Drath's tactical feeds lit up with human nonsense. Meme compilations danced across their displays, cats knocking over cups, people falling off bicycles, absurd dance videos. Moments later, the first wave of confusion spread through the outpost. What is this?" came a bewildered voice over the Drath comms. Callahan grinned. "Let's kick it up a notch. Deploy the sound files." A chorus of bizarre noises followed. Rubber chicken squeaks, honking horns, and a particularly obnoxious human laugh track that looped endlessly. Drath officers tried to re-establish order, shouting commands over the comms, but every channel was filled with the chaos of human humor. Tactical briefings dissolved into utter disarray. The outpost fell into complete confusion. Soldiers, distracted and disoriented, wandered aimlessly, some laughing despite themselves, others staring in bewilderment at the strange content flooding their screens. A few Drath units even dropped their weapons, too busy trying to decipher what they were watching. Meanwhile, Callahan and his squad infiltrated the base with ease. The few Drath soldiers they encountered were so disoriented by the constant barrage of memes that they barely noticed the humans slipping past them. At the heart of the outpost, they found the control room, its occupants locked in a shouting match over whether the broadcast was a weapon or some bizarre form of psychological warfare. Callahan casually strolled into the room, grinning. "Afternoon, folks," he said, tipping an imaginary hat. "Hope you're enjoying the show." The Drath officers whirled toward him, weapons raised. But before they could fire, Callahan held up a datapad displaying a meme featuring a dog in a spacesuit, with the caption, "When you invade a planet, but forget your snacks." One of the Drath soldiers blinked and then snorted. Callahan's grin widened. "Gotcha." Within moments, the entire control room erupted in laughter. It was as though the floodgates had opened, years of tension and discipline shattering under the weight of absurd humor. Drath soldiers doubled over, some dropping their weapons, others wiping tears from their eyes. The human squad secured the control room without firing a single shot. When they returned to the Union base hours later, victorious and unharmed, Captain Varlix was waiting. His mandibles clicked irritably as he approached Callahan. "You won," Varlix admitted grudgingly, "but I still don't understand how." Callahan clapped the insectoid captain on the back. "That's the beauty of it, Varlix. Humor isn't just about jokes, it's about connection. It's about breaking through the walls people build around themselves. Even the Drath, for all their cold, calculated discipline, couldn't resist it." Varlix stared at him, antennae twitching. "I do not see the tactical value." Callahan chuckled. "You will. Give it time." As the sun set over the Union camp, soldiers gathered around campfires, sharing stories of the bizarre victory. Even the most battle-hardened veterans cracked smiles as they recounted how the mighty Drath had been undone by memes and rubber chickens. For the first time in a long while, the weight of the war felt just a little lighter, and as Callahan sat by the fire, sipping a cup of rationed coffee, he glanced over at Varlix and saw something unexpected, a tiny twitch of amusement in the insectoid's expression. "You know," Varlix said slowly, "I may have enjoyed one of the broadcasts. Just a little." Callahan's grin was pure mischief. "See? Told you. Humor wins wars." Varlix clicked his mandibles in what could almost be called a laugh. "Don't get cocky, human." But the challenge in his voice was light, and for the first time, Callahan felt like they were making real progress, not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts of their allies. As the fire crackled and the soldiers settled in for the night, Webb leaned toward Callahan and whispered, "So, what's the plan for the next mission?" Callahan grinned. "I'm thinking karaoke." The days following the Drath outpost victory were filled with cautious optimism. News of the peculiar triumph spread quickly across the front lines, becoming a legend in its own right. Union soldiers, once weighed down by despair, began trading jokes and pulling small pranks during downtime. They laughed again, not just at their enemies, but at the absurdity of life in the middle of an intergalactic war. And yet, humor could only carry them so far. War had a way of clawing its way back into every crack of joy. It was relentless. It happened during a routine supply run. Callahan and his squad were escorting a convoy through hostile territory when the Drath ambushed them. It wasn't just a small skirmish this time. This was an organized strike, coordinated and vicious. Explosions lit the sky like fireworks, but there was nothing to celebrate. "Ambush!" Lieutenant Webb shouted, pulling Callahan down as a mortar round screamed past overhead. The convoy scattered, soldiers scrambling for cover behind jagged rock formations. Callahan's heart pounded as plasma bolts filled the air. Astra, the AI embedded in their comms systems, spoke into his ear with calm efficiency. "We have enemy forces closing in on 3 sides. Reinforcements are 20 minutes out." "We don't have 20 minutes," Callahan muttered. Before he could issue an order, he heard a shout. Sergeant Marco, one of the heartbeats of their squad, had been hit. Callahan sprinted toward him, dodging enemy fire. When he reached Marco, the sight hit him like a gut punch. Marco lay on the ground, his armor scorched, blood seeping through cracks in the plating. "No, no, no," Callahan whispered, kneeling beside him. Marco's face twisted in a pained grin. "Looks like they finally got me, boss." "Don't you dare," Callahan snapped, tearing open Marco's medkit with shaky hands. "You're not going anywhere." The battlefield around them raged on, but in that moment, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of them. Webb crouched beside Callahan, her face pale. "We need to move him, or he's not going to make it." Marco coughed, trying to laugh through the pain. "Hey, Captain, got any jokes for this?" Callahan's throat tightened. Jokes were his armor, his weapon, but right now, every punchline felt hollow. His mind was blank, lost in the weight of what was happening. "Just hang on, Marco," Callahan whispered. "Reinforcements are on the way." Marco's smile wavered, but he squeezed Callahan's arm. "Tell a good one when I'm out of this." Callahan nodded, his heart breaking. "Yeah, the best one." The medics arrived just in time to stabilize Marco, hauling him onto a stretcher as the sounds of battle faded into the distance. Callahan watched them carry his friend away, feeling helpless in a way he hadn't in a long time. That night, the squad gathered around a fire at their makeshift camp, but this time, there were no jokes, no laughter, just silence. Webb sat beside Callahan, both of them staring into the flames. "He'll make it," she said softly, but it sounded more like a hope than a certainty. Callahan rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion catching up with him. "It doesn't feel right, does it?" Laughing. "When things like this happen." Webb was quiet for a moment. "Number, but that's why we have to." Callahan looked at her, surprised. "Look," Webb continued, her voice steady. "Humor isn't just for the good times. It's for the worst moments, too. It's what keeps us human. If we stop laughing, we've already lost." Callahan thought about that for a long time. When the fire began to burn low, the rest of the squad drifted off to sleep. But Callahan stayed, lost in his thoughts, until he heard footsteps behind him. It was Captain Varlix. The insectoid captain stood awkwardly at the edge of the campfire's glow, clearly out of his element. "Mind if I join you?" Varlix asked. Callahan gestured toward the fire. "Pull up a log." Varlix sat down stiffly, folding his spindly limbs beneath him. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. Then, to Callahan's surprise, Varlix spoke. "When I was a larva," Varlix began, his mandibles twitching in what might have been embarrassment, "I got stuck in a sap trap for 3 days. The elders had to pry me out with a stick." Callahan blinked, then let out a startled laugh. "You, Captain Varlix? Stuck in sap?" Varlix clicked his mandibles, clearly flustered. "Yes, it was Not my finest moment. Callahan grinned, the tension in his chest loosening just a little. That's the best story I've heard all day. Varlix tilted his head. It's strange, isn't it, to find humor in something so ridiculous? Callahan leaned back, gazing at the stars. That's what makes it worth telling. The stupid stuff keeps us going. It reminds us that not everything has to be so damn serious. For the first time, Varlix let out a soft, clicking chuckle. Perhaps there is some wisdom in your methods after all, human. Callahan smiled, feeling the smallest spark of hope rekindle in his chest. The night wore on, and eventually the camp fell silent, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Callahan stayed awake, watching the stars overhead, thinking about Marco, and about all the others they had lost along the way. Humor wouldn't bring them back. It wouldn't stop the pain. But maybe, just maybe, it could help them carry. As Callahan stared into the embers, he made a quiet promise to himself. No matter how dark things got, he would keep telling jokes. For Marco, for the squad, for everyone. The next mission Callahan proposed was, to put it mildly, insane. His squad sat in the cramped briefing room aboard the Union warship, wide-eyed as he laid out the plan. So, Callahan began, spinning a marker between his fingers, we're going to sneak onto the Drath command ship. Not to blow it up, not to sabotage it, though that would be fun, but to play some jokes, maybe start a dance-off, and, if we're lucky, break their whole operation apart from the inside. Lieutenant Webb leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. That's it. That's your grand strategy. That's the gist of it, Callahan said, grinning. We're going to short-circuit their morale. The other squad members exchanged glances. Captain Varlix, who had joined the briefing, clicked his mandibles disapprovingly. This has to be the most reckless, nonsensical idea I have ever encountered. Thanks, Callahan replied cheerfully. I aim to impress. The plan, wild as it seemed, hinged on the fact that the Drath leadership was rigid, disciplined, and unimaginative. A direct assault on their command ship would be suicidal, but if Callahan and his team could disrupt their operations from within by turning the cold heart of the Empire into a chaotic circus, they might cause enough confusion to break the Drath's iron grip on the battlefield. The Union's high command was skeptical, but desperate. After much debate, they gave Callahan the green light. The mission would be simple. Infiltrate the Drath flagship, broadcast chaos, and get out before everything exploded. Hopefully, not literally. The insertion was smoother than Callahan expected. Disguised as prisoners, the squad allowed themselves to be captured by Drath patrols and brought aboard the massive command ship, the Black Fang. The ship was a terrifying monolith, bristling with weapons and command nodes, the very heart of the Drath war machine. As they were escorted through the cold steel corridors, Callahan nudged Webb with his elbow. You ready for the fun part? Webb smirked. Always. Once inside the holding cells, the team made quick work of their captors, neutralizing the guards and tapping into the ship's internal communication systems. Astra, the AII embedded in their comms gear, hummed quietly in Callahan's ear. Connection established, Astra whispered. We're live on every internal channel. Callahan rubbed his hands together. Let the games begin. Within moments, the Drath command ship was flooded with human nonsense. Every screen on the ship, tactical displays, communication monitors, even personal datapad, lit up with a bizarre array of Earth humor. Memes scrolled across displays faster than the Drath officers could shut them down. Videos of people dancing, cats knocking over objects, and absurd joke compilations played on a loop. The response was immediate, and exactly what Callahan had hoped for. Shut it down, one Drath officer bellowed over the comms, his voice tinged with frustration. What is this madness? In the control room, Drath officers scrambled to regain control of their systems, but every attempt only triggered more absurd content. They tried to lock out the communications channels, only to have their firewalls replaced with colorful, taunting error messages. Do you want to delete your pride? YN. One message read, accompanied by a cheerful thumbs-up emoji. The chaos spread like wildfire. Soldiers throughout the ship, already on edge from months of relentless combat, found themselves helplessly distracted. Some burst into laughter despite themselves. Others, thoroughly confused, abandoned their posts to investigate the source of the absurd transmissions. Meanwhile, Callahan and his squad moved through the ship like ghosts, sowing discord wherever they went. They rigged holographic projectors to display absurd scenes, like a ballroom dance party breaking out in the middle of the mess hall. They left fake warning signs in the corridors. Beware of unexpected disco ball drops. In one hallway, they encountered a squad of Droth guards. The guards raised their weapons, ready to fire. But before anyone could pull the trigger, Callahan stepped forward, holding up a hand. "Hey, fellas," he said casually. "What do you get when you cross an alien invasion with really bad leadership?" The Droth guards stared at him, confused. Callahan grinned. "A command ship full of memes." One of the guards snorted, a small, reluctant sound, but it was enough. Laughter spread through the group like wildfire, and within seconds, the guards were doubled over, clutching their sides. Webb stepped forward, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're ridiculous." Callahan winked. "And it works." The squad continued toward the control room, leaving behind a trail of laughter and disarray. They reached their destination, just as the Droth leadership descended into full-blown panic. The officers in the control room were shouting over one another, their carefully maintained order crumbling under the weight of absurdity. Callahan slipped into the room unnoticed, stepping up to the main console. He tapped a few keys, activating the ship-wide intercom. "Attention, Droth personnel," he announced, his voice booming through every speaker on the ship. "This is Captain Callahan of the Union. Just wanted to let you know you've been pranked. Have a nice day." As the message echoed through the corridors, the Droth officers stared at him, dumbfounded. Then, to Callahan's surprise, one of the senior officers, a grim-looking Droth commander, burst into laughter. It started as a low chuckle, then grew into a full, hearty laugh. The other officers, their tension shattered, followed suit. In that moment, the iron discipline of the Droth Empire cracked. Callahan leaned back against the console, grinning. "Told ya, humor wins wars." The aftermath was swift and decisive. With their command ship in chaos, the Droth fleet faltered, retreating from the front lines. Union forces seized the opportunity, launching a counteroffensive that drove the enemy back to the edge of their territory. Back aboard the Union warship, Callahan's team was greeted with cheers and applause. Soldiers from every species congratulated them, laughing as they recounted the absurd details of the mission. Even Captain Varlix, ever the skeptic, couldn't hide his amusement. "I still don't understand how you pulled that off," he admitted, his mandibles twitching in what might have been a smile. Callahan shrugged. "Simple. You break the rules, you break the tension. And once the tension's gone, you've already won." As the celebrations continued, Astra's voice whispered in Callahan's ear. "You know, Captain, you might have just changed the course of this war." Callahan smiled, raising a toast to his squad. "Here's to winning battles the only way we know how, one joke at a time." As Callahan clinked glasses with his squad mates, a thought crossed his mind. If the Droth were this easy to throw off balance, what other surprises were waiting just beyond the next horizon? The Droth fleet had retreated, scattering like leaves in a storm, leaving behind a battlefield that now echoed with the cheers instead of gunfire. The victory wasn't just a tactical one. It was a shift in momentum that the Union hadn't experienced in years. Soldiers from across the galaxy celebrated, and laughter, once a rare sound on the front lines, now rippled through every camp. Captain Callahan leaned against a crate, watching the celebrations unfold around him. His squad was in the thick of it, playing pranks on each other, trading jokes, and recounting the mission aboard the Droth flagship like it was the punchline to the universe's biggest joke. Even the normally stoic Captain Varlix was awkwardly participating, trying, unsuccessfully, to tell a joke about Trainax larvae and an asteroid belt. Lieutenant Webb appeared at Callahan's side, holding out a flask. "We did it, boss," she said with a grin. "We really did it." Callahan took the flask, raising it in a small toast. "To chaos, comedy, and rubber chickens." Webb laughed and clinked the flask against his, the real heroes of this war. As the two of them shared a drink, Astra's voice buzzed softly in Callahan's ear. "Captain, I have something you'll want to hear. It's Unexpected. Callahan tapped his earpiece. Go on, Astra. There was a brief pause, and then Astra continued, her tone tinged with something close to amazement. A Droth ambassador just contacted the Union. They've requested a ceasefire. Apparently, they want to discuss cultural exchanges. Callahan raised an eyebrow. Cultural exchanges? With us, specifically with the humans. Astra confirmed. They say their soldiers are struggling to function after being exposed to humor. They want to understand it better. Think of it as psychological defense. Webb nearly choked on her drink, laughing. You're telling me we just memed an entire empire into peace talks? Callahan shook his head, grinning. I told you humor wins wars. Astra hummed thoughtfully. Technically, the war isn't over yet, but this could be the beginning of something different. The idea of sitting across from Droth ambassadors, teaching them the intricacies of knock-knock jokes and sarcasm, was so absurd that it almost seemed fitting. If war was absurd, why shouldn't peace be just as ridiculous? A few days later, the first meeting between the Union and the Droth took place on neutral ground, a barren moon orbiting a long-forgotten star. Callahan was among the delegation, dressed in his combat fatigues with a rubber chicken tucked under one arm like a ceremonial artifact. Webb stood beside him, trying not to laugh as they approached the Droth representatives. The Droth ambassador was tall and imposing, with black armor polished to a shine, but there was a noticeable shift in their demeanor, something hesitant, almost curious. It was as if they were encountering a species of creatures they didn't fully understand and weren't sure whether to fear or admire. Captain Callahan, the ambassador said, inclining their head slightly. Your methods have been effective. Too effective. We underestimated you. Callahan grinned. Yeah, we get that a lot. The ambassador hesitated, then leaned closer as if sharing a secret. We have been studying your humor. It is a strange weapon. Dangerous, but effective. Webb whispered to Callahan, barely containing her laughter. They think jokes are weapons. Callahan shrugged. They're not wrong. The ambassador straightened. We wish to learn. If we understand this humor, perhaps we can guard against it in the future. Callahan tilted his head, considering the ambassador's words. Then, with a mischievous grin, he held up the rubber chicken. Lesson 1. Never underestimate the power of absurdity. The ambassador stared at the rubber chicken for a long moment, their expression unreadable. Then, slowly, they reached out and took it from Callahan's hand, as if it were a sacred object. The other Droth representatives murmured among themselves, clearly puzzled but intrigued. And just like that, the first step toward peace was taken, not with weapons, but with a joke. Back aboard the Union warship, the mood was lighter than it had been in years. Soldiers from every species shared stories about the peace talks, laughing at the sheer absurdity of it all. The war wasn't officially over, but for the first time, there was hope that it could end, not with destruction, but with understanding. Callahan sat with his squad around a campfire, watching the stars flicker through the viewport. Varlix sat nearby, awkwardly trying to tell another joke, much to the amusement of the group. So, a Kalrathi, a Traynax, and a human walk into a bar. Varlix began, his mandibles clicking nervously, and Webb prompted, grinning. Varlix hesitated. That is the joke. They walk into a bar. The squad erupted into laughter, not at the joke itself, but at the sheer awkwardness of Varlix's delivery. Even Varlix chuckled softly, clearly pleased with his attempt. As the laughter died down, Callahan leaned back, letting the warmth of the fire wash over him. For a moment, everything felt right. The war, the jokes, the absurdity of it all. It had brought them here, to this moment of peace and camaraderie. Astra's voice whispered in his ear, soft and reassuring. You did good, Captain. Callahan smiled. We all did, Astra. Every last one of us. The fire crackled, and the stars above seemed just a little brighter. The war wasn't over. There would be more battles, more challenges, more losses. But as long as they could laugh, they could face anything. Hey, Callahan, Webb said, nudging him with her elbow. What's next? After the war, I mean. Callahan grinned, the answer coming to him as easily as a punchline. I'm thinking comedy club on Mars. Laughter in low gravity. What do you think? Webb laughed, shaking her head. You're impossible. Damn right, Callahan replied, raising his cup in a toast to the impossible. The squad raised their cups, clinking them together in a quiet, heartfelt toast to laughter, to survival, to friendship, and to the punchlines they hadn't discovered yet. As the night wore on and the fire burned low, Callahan leaned back and looked up at the stars, a quiet contentment settling over him. The future was uncertain, and the war wasn't over. But one thing was clear. As long as they had humor, they had hope. And that, Callahan thought with a grin, was the greatest weapon of all.